Joining me now is Dr. Olga Ravasi, who's an expert in Balkan affairs, South Central Europe, and the Middle East, carrying the designation of highly qualified expert per the DNI. She advises U.S. corporate, government, and non-governmental organization clients on matters affecting their plans, interests, and operations in these regions. She serves as a board member, regional expert, and advisor to Crime Stoppers Global Solutions, a U.S.-based international NGO committed to combating transnational crime. She's got a long bio. One of her websites is sava-pac.org. That's sava-pac.org. Dobrodošli na TNT, Dr. Ravasi.
Hvala, bolje vas našli, and thank you for having me.
How is life in the sunny and free state of Florida? I think that's where you are.
Yes, I am. Life is fabulous in the free state of Florida. Going through the COVID pandemic, we actually have not gone through it because we lived our lives as normal. The children were in schools, no masks. It was just fabulous. And Governor DeSantis continues to actually plow forward, even on the vaccinations. Just recently, they talked about, and actually there's a law now I didn't follow quite closely, but the hospitals are now forbidden from even offering vaccinations to the population younger than 50 years old. They could possibly suggest to those older than 50 years old, but younger than 50, it is punishable by law now, offering or suggesting. So everybody, welcome to Florida, but don't bring your northern voting habits over here.
Yeah, that's I've met so many people who have been fleeing California for either Texas, Florida, or Mexico here where I am. And yeah, just like kind of like you, I was living in Kazakhstan where they literally locked us up during the pandemic in 2020. They said one day you're not allowed to leave your apartment, and the next day you're allowed to leave, but only one person with the card that we give you to the supermarket, bank, or pharmacy. And we headed back to Mexico, which was kind of like Florida. And I've been looking at your work. You've been I enjoy very much your analysis and commentary. You've been on TNT before a few times with my buddy George, my virtual colleague George Eliason, who does great work. And I kind of want to get your big picture take on things. You know, a lot is happening. For the longest time, I've been saying that, you know, I think going back a decade when I was still teaching, I was telling students, you know, we're entering into a period of the 1930s again. Economic collapse, world war, tyranny, globalism, a push again for world governments, everything that we saw a century ago. And so, Dr. Ravasi, what's going on in your analysis?
Oh, so much is going on. And I always, given that this is my expertise, as you said, I carry the designation of the highly qualified expert for the DNI, and my expertise is in the Balkan affairs, which I am sure you can appreciate just by our ancestry. We have gone through some of these dark periods, and I consistently, in all of my analysis, keep going back to former Yugoslavia and to the Balkans, and the trajectory of what we are facing right now in our nation here in the United States is so eerily similar to what we've seen in Yugoslavia. And just before we got on, I was kind of looking at some of my old archives where, you know, you look at some of these agencies here in the United States that got weaponized, that literally painted a target on the backs of, you know, the American people. And a similar thing happened in Yugoslavia. You know, the same culprits have gone around the world, perfected this methodology of colored revolution and regime change, utilizing literally everything that they can by the book, making sure that wherever they operate, they can actually manipulate and use certain differences and divisiveness of specific regions. In the matters of Balkans and Yugoslavia, that is, of course, the lengthy history of religious or national divide. But for the United States, obviously, the one that triggers consistently and that produces that kind of highly emotional response is racism. So A lot of this divisiveness is not only being implemented here in the United States, it's obviously implemented around the world because the globalists operate everywhere and they use the same tactics and the same methodology. We're looking at this entire mess in Ukraine, but again, Ukraine didn't begin yesterday. Ukraine didn't begin last year in February of 2022. Ukraine began in 2014 with, again, another colored revolution and a coup and a regime change of a democratically elected president. So we're looking, as I said, at the same blueprint. Arab Spring was one of those. So, the powers that be continue on their path of destruction, and that's what we're facing around the world. And, after President Trump's administration, where I was very active, not only in the foreign policy arena, but on transnational crimes and counterterrorism, entered the Biden administration with an array of characters that have done the same things around the world, stemming back from the Clinton administration, Bush's senior and junior, the Obama administration. You see the same faces consistently present now on the scenes. And they have literally entered, again, entering this phase of war, of being very trigger happy and being on a pathway of multiple wars right now, not only NATO and the United States facing Russia. Essentially, that's what's happening in Ukraine. But we're on a pathway on a war footing against China, against Iran. Obviously, we've been on a war footing for a long time in the Middle East. So, but overall, as they say, follow the money. And it's a big transfer of wealth. And it ensures that some of these players and some of these globalist organizations will not become obsolete. It ensures essentially their longevity. That's in short.
Yeah. And, it seems indeed that they're going for the gold for the full spectrum dominance, and any of the remaining hotspots they don't control, whether it's Venezuela or Syria, Russia, China. Tomorrow I'm having on some of the folks from the New York Young Republicans Club to talk about their piece in, I think it was Newsweek, on Hungary, the paprika revolution, as they've called it. Samantha Powers of USAID, you perhaps have seen, she's been visiting Hungary, prepping the ground for, I guess, the paprika revolution against Orban. So, Dr. Ravasi, we're going to jump to a short news update. We'll be right back.
Hey, what are you guys doing?
We're breaking news.
Oh, okay, carry on.
TNT Radio News.
This is James O'Neill with a check of today's headlines. Kathy Chung, President Joe Biden's former primary gatekeeper, has agreed to partially comply with the House Oversight Committee's probe into the classified document scandal and the Biden family's international business schemes. Several thousand people turned out for peace demonstrations in the Italian cities of Genoa and Milan on Saturday. Union members and left-wing activists claimed, among other things, that authorities in Rome have breached national law by sending weapons to Ukraine.
Do you have a suggestion for a possible guest you'd like to hear on TNT Radio? Or perhaps you have a topic you feel we should discuss? Then we want to hear from you. Simply complete the suggestion form on the TNT Radio website. Help us make a difference on TNT Radio.
All right, we're back with Dr. Olga Ravasi. Feel free to call in. Phone numbers are always at the top of TNTRadio.live. But just real quick, I know we could do 1 or 2 hours on what happened in Yugoslavia, but just real quick, because I think, like, in a nutshell, my view is what happened in Yugoslavia. And, throughout the 1980s, my parents are from Croatia, but, they were born in Yugoslavia. And I mention frequently that my grandfather had actually been a Nazi prisoner. I think he was a partisan, but he didn't. I believe he didn't go along with the 3 years that we had the Croatian Nazi regime. And I frequently visited in the 1980s. I mean, they sent me alone. I'd be there for months on end in Croatia, Yugoslavia, and I lived there. And during 1994, still during the war, I lived in Split for a year as a kid. And my view is that, as you mentioned, what the globalists do is there were organic problems, right? Squabbles between the Croats and the Serbs that, every nation's, you've got Mexicans and Americans, right? Issues. You've got anywhere you go on the planet, there are these organic, perennial squabbles. But then I view largely, what happened in Yugoslavia a consequence of Anglo-American globalist imperial machinations. And it's, classic divide and conquer. Like Iraq was one nation, and then after they went in with the war in Iraq, they broke it up into Shia, Sunni. I'm forgetting the third now, but they break it up into these divisions. They want to do that in Russia now, as you said. They want to do that in the U.S. and they find the weak points, and so your further thoughts on that? It's like they're applying the same framework in different ways across the planet. No.
Absolutely, and that is a great way of putting it. They are very well versed in exploiting those old historical squabbles, whether they are ethnic or religious or racial. As you said, every country, every nook and corner in this world has some, which is essentially natural. However, they're very good at manipulating those, weaponizing them, and pinning people against one another, and of course, divide and conquer. So this is why we are consistently in a meddling phase, but in particular for Yugoslavia, we have to put that in a specific time and into the construct of what Yugoslavia meant as a nation, as a member and a founding member, actually, of the non-aligned movement. If you remember, after World War II, the famous note that Tito at the time sent to Stalin in, I believe, 1948. And so Tito was one of those good manipulators where he could work with the East, he could work with the West. So Yugoslavia was able to use all of those resources and to create an interesting experiment. Yugoslavia, I would say, was European Union before European Union. Yugoslavia was, the United States on a smaller scale, where you could call everybody Yugoslav, or as we do here, an American, no matter what the background is. But at the same time, there were obviously some of those differences that the communists suppressed, between the Serbs and the Croats, between the Muslim populations there. And all of that was very easily exploited. But the reason why it was exploited was because Yugoslavia at the time in the 1990s was deemed expendable. Because if you remember the Berlin Wall falling, Margaret Thatcher was one of the first people who, first of all, was not too happy with reunification of Germany and was extremely unhappy with this interest to dismantle Yugoslavia. Soviet Union was falling apart. So as the Warsaw Pact fell apart, NATO was deemed obsolete, right? If you don't need NATO as an alliance to offset the Warsaw Pact doesn't exist anymore. Well, NATO really didn't have a role. Well, NATO needed to reinvent itself at the time. So Yugoslavia served as a great reason for NATO to continue meddling. Because again, you look at these 4- and 5-star generals, they need to keep their appearances and their jobs. And given my closeness to some of these generals who were involved in the Yugoslav wars and who ended up being placed highly in the Trump administration, they really understood what was happening at the time. And they were very much against NATO meddling and NATO being weaponized, and the Clinton administration doing what they did to Yugoslavia. But it wasn't actually even Bill Clinton. It was Madeleine Albright and Sandy Berger and all of these people who wanted to see how they could weaponize NATO and how they could use its power to essentially resolve some of their personal preferences and some of their globalist views and impose those around the world. And that is essentially the aftermath that we are living through to today. The fall of the Berlin Wall, at the time, if you all remember, Gorbachev and Reagan discussed what NATO's role would be in the world. And the exact words were used that NATO would not move an inch once Germany was reunified. And what happened? NATO started moving exceedingly fast forward towards Russia's borders. So what we're seeing in Ukraine today is Russia has been warning us for 15 years and even more that these are their red lines. And as I said in my recent interview elsewhere, look, every nation has their own natural sovereign right to protect their interests, just like we do here in the United States. Well, so does every other country. And apparently these were the red lines for Russia. Ukraine is their doorstep. You know, we constantly keep asking ourselves, well, what would happen if the Russians placed nuclear missiles in Mexico, where you are? What would happen if they did it in Cuba? We know what happened, you know, but what is very scary is that we are in a much hotter war footing right now than we were even during 1960s, during the Cold War, during 1962 and the Cuban Missile Crisis. We are inching closer and closer towards World War III. In fact, I deeply believe that we are technically in World War III right now. It's just that warfare today is a little different. It is not conventional, but nevertheless, we are certainly within the realm. And what worries me is that the talk of a nuclear warfare is being discussed very casually. And what that assures, obviously, is the mutual destruction. But even the mutual destruction is not even-handed. You know, it's not one size fits all. Then you have to, and I'm not by any means a military analyst, but I trust those that I talk to about this, and they just recently sent me a document specifically on this mutually assured destruction. And the destruction would be vast for actually the West, much more so than for Russia, because then you have to look at the population size, for example, of NATO countries versus Russia. You have to look at big cities that have over 1 million people. Well, more of those we have obviously within NATO countries. We have 63 cities versus 16 only in Russia. You got to look at the GOP. You got to look at the land area that this mutually assured destruction is covering. So we would be, essentially, we would be like Western nations, or West as the geopolitical construct, would be a much bigger loser in this. God forbid we get there. So, I mean, again, looking back, not only to Yugoslavia, but to the fall of Berlin Wall, to the breakup of the Soviet Union, we are living this today. We're looking at even the Middle East with the Arab Spring. We're looking at consistent disturbances there. We're looking at what's happening with China and Taiwan, and we're there. I'm not very optimistic, honestly, given that I know who is at the helm of our foreign policy right now. You look at Nuland, you look at the Kagans, obviously, behind her, who are huge neocons. Obviously, she's married to one of the Kagans. You look at these old characters, as you mentioned, even Samantha Powers landing in Hungary last week and promoting, when they start talking about human rights and equality, which means equity in this woke verbiage of today, they are trying to get rid of Victor Orban for sure, because he's not playing nice with this entire Zelensky is God, and we all have to listen to him navigating not only the United States military, but the entire NATO military, and directing the US taxpayer dollars, even, not only to foot the bill for this crazy war, but to now pay the pensions of Ukrainians. And meanwhile, Ohio and our infrastructure, everything is falling apart in this country, but yet we continue sending immense amounts of dollars over to Ukraine, which has become a big laundromat.
Yeah, I'd agree with you on the World War III situation. Many of my guests as well. And just recently I was finding tweets by former Prime Minister of Malaysia, Dr. Mahathir Mohamad, and he was saying that Malaysia is experiencing shortages in inflation, that it's important that the country prepares contingency plans to deal with what may be the beginning of a third world war. You've got so many prominent people now saying this is it, unfortunately. And you mentioned the late Gorby. I shook hands with Gorby 6 years ago. I went out to Russia with Sharon Tennyson in peace diplomacy. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with some Croatian intellectuals. There's very few, you can count them on one hand, that I like to listen to, but there's Davor Domazet-Lošo and Slavko Kulic, among others, who I think have the similar analysis as you and I. And I've been reading Slavko for like 2 decades, and recently Lošo. And I've got a theory that, we had Yugoslavia, which was, as you said, non-aligned, sort of independent. They couldn't really control it. They were trying in the 80s, to get us under IMF and World Bank, and they break us up. And a lot of Croatians today call EU Euroslavia. And I'm not a fan of Yugoslavia in the sense, collectivism, anything that's centralized,
communist, socialist, absolutely.
Right. And so EU is this anti-democratic globalist construct, and it's almost as if they detonate Yugoslavia, balkanize it, break it into little weak pieces that can then be manipulated, and then we've got our independence for a couple of years, and then Croatia, for example, Slovenia, and then Croatia joins in 2013 the Yugoslavia. So we reintegrate into a globalist, supranational, collectivist structure that they control, which is the EU. Absolutely. And I feel like in the US now, getting to the game for America, it's not conspiracy theory. North American Union. I conducted the last living interview with Dr. Robert Pastor of the CFR, who was the father of the North American Union. And it's like we had just 5 months ago, my Mexican president, AMLO, openly said, we want to copy the EU and integrate Canada, USA, and Mexico. And then a few weeks later, it's just a couple months ago, the ex-president of Ecuador, Correa, said the same thing. He's like, we want to copy the EU and South America and create a Latin American Union with a Latin American currency. And sorry, Dr. Ravasi, we're going to jump to our break. It's time for a break, and then we can continue this on the other side. Again, the website is sava-pac.org. We'll be right back.
Give me a minute with TNT Radio's Steve Malzberg.
A major Irish teachers union has come under fire for a video which encourages teachers to help kids switch their gender. The newsletter provided a sample of the video from Into, the Irish National Teachers Organization. Sit back and listen to this from Facilitating a Social Transition.
Tilly wasn't happy because everyone saw her as a boy, but she knew she was really a girl. My pupil Ray asked, so boys can change into girls? And then Julie chimed in, and girls can change into boys? Yes, I said. Sometimes, while the doctor says a baby is a boy, as that baby grows up, they feel inside that they're not a boy. While they might have a boy's name, like Tilly, they know they aren't a boy and want to change their name. The same can happen for a girl. By making those changes, the person feels happier and more like themselves.
Now, the union claims that the video is not intended for students, is not part of the curriculum, but rather acts as a support material for teachers to prepare for what might come up in the classroom. Doesn't matter. It's sick. Its premise is sick, and any use of this by teachers would be nothing short of child abuse. Thanks for giving me a minute. I'm Steve Malzberg for TNT Radio.
Everybody's terrified of cancer, the big C. They don't want to talk about embarrassing things, so blood in their bowel motions, going more frequently, a persistent cough, losing weight. I remember a wee man who didn't come to my surgery for ages, and all he would do was apologise and say, oh, sorry, doctor, I know if I had come, I know you'd have got me sorted. We are not too busy. We are very, very keen to see our patients as soon as we possibly can. So please don't get scared. Get checked.
A cashless society means zero cash. No car boot sales. No markets. No tooth fairy or piggy banks. No saving cash for a rainy day. No buying anything with privacy. Digital currency means every cent you receive will be recorded and every transaction tracked. Lighting the fuse for freedom. TNT Radio.
We're back on our final segment with Dr. Olga Ravasi. And just to finish my point before the break, we were talking about Yugoslavia and then Croatia and the EU. And so Croatia is reintegrated into the EU. And I feel like they're trying to maybe do that again in the U.S., where they might use, Mexican narco cartel issues, migration. I mean, as you said before, they can detonate in any which way. They can create a second civil war. People are talking about a national divorce now. Marjorie Taylor Greene's talking about.
Yes.
And then that would sort of break up the U.S., maybe even spill over to Canada and Mexico. And then the solution again, years down the line, would be a North American Union where we're all happily integrated. Your further thoughts on what's going on in the U.S., this talk of national divorce and so on?
Well, so this idea of the North American Union has been talked about for a long time. And I've been aware of it ever since the inception of the European Union, because what the globalists want are just several controllable blocks and essentially the sphere of interest with specific monetary structures. So from what I was understanding, as they were developing the euro, apparently what we would have over here is something called Amero. And I've heard this many, many times before, but I just wanted to quickly go back. You're right. We could talk for hours. There's so much to unpack here, especially in terms of what's happening in the United States. But just going back quickly to European Union and, for example, Croatia, who has joined the European Union, but I don't know how much you follow, for example, President of Croatia, Zoran Milanovic, who is like a stark contrast of the Prime Minister, Plenković. I don't know how much you followed what Milanovic is saying, but Milanovic is one of those who is also not really playing this game of let's fund this war in Ukraine, let's keep sending weapons, let's participate in being all united against Russia. He even made some comments about what they're doing to Serbia, even though he's not really too fond of the Serbs, but he was very bluntly honest about what was done to Serbia, bombing Serbia, placing Camp Bondsteel there in Kosovo, seceding part of Serbia's sovereign territory. He literally said the other day, we stole it. We took it away. So, I mean, Milanovic is one of those very interesting figures that kind of does the similar things that Victor Orban is doing and is very opposite from his own prime minister over there. So, I mean, you have, sparks of some of these individuals now who are sick and tired of the unelected bureaucrats from the European Union dictating to everybody, which is, again, back to this socialist communist structure that they escaped from in Yugoslavia, but they are now implementing within European Union. And obviously, you have our own elite here in the United States doing the exact same thing. And why do you see the exact same things around the world? But because the same elite is running it. I mean, you're looking at the World Economic Forum, you're looking at, several of these groups where the powerful elite gets together and essentially everybody is enslaved to the powerful corporations and the powerful banks. And one other interesting piece about Yugoslavia, and I will finish with that, there's a great documentary that not only talks about Yugoslavia, but then when you see how the media participates in this fake news, biased journalism, advocacy-ridden, toxic journalism, which Samantha Power certainly is a byproduct of that. She, in fact, started it. That's what started in Yugoslavia. That's what's been permeating this kind of warmongering around the world, the role of the media in all of this. But there is a great piece, it's called Confession of a CIA Agent, who says, it's an interview with Robert Bayer, who is a former CIA officer, very prominent one, who worked all around the world under Bush, under Clinton, and was actually sent to Yugoslavia at the time, who actually said they gave us millions of dollars to dismantle Yugoslavia. Well, that's exactly what's happening around the world. And the same people who have done this around the world have brought it over here to the United States and have actually done it to President Trump. I mean, some of us who have lived through this could recognize the exact same blueprint of how, from the moment he literally came down that escalator and announced his presidency, you could tell how they were following the same exact steps to weaponize the intelligence agencies and every single agency here that they possibly could to enact a coup against the democratically elected president. So, I mean, this sounds very familiar to me. But you're right, a lot of polarization, talk of national divorce, although, you know, some Republicans kind of came out criticizing Marjorie Taylor Greene about her comments. But I cannot think of one single issue where, as conservatives and liberals, we can come together and actually agree. I don't see anything where we would have that. And you know, President Biden talked about being the president of unity. He has just further polarized the nation. And, you know, unfortunately, it's very sad to watch him. I don't think he really understands where he is. And whoever the handlers are, this is just elderly abuse at this point. Mm-hmm. But nevertheless, the nation is completely polarized. And you're right, there's constant talk of even civil wars. I mean, who knows? We're headed for a very bloody divorce, not just nationally here in the United States, but the world is collapsing around us. But we all understand that war is a racket, and what's happening in Ukraine right now is in fact prolonging the fiat currency that we have, which is the dollar. And it's interesting because Russia, China, and some of the, you know, emerging economies are trying to move away from the dollar. So there's this global de-dollarization, which is an escape mechanism, you know, to break free from the grip of these bankers and parasitic financial elite. So the fiat system that's being centered in London and New York and elsewhere is pretty much being artificially kept alive. It's on life support, but it's being kept alive through this war in Ukraine. So we, in fact, as Americans, American people don't have an interest in this war whatsoever. But the American and global elite have a huge interest in prolonging this war because that ensures, again, their longevity and ensures the fiat currency. So, but unfortunately, they miscalculated because the sanctions that they keep imposing on Russia, they have boomeranged. And the first ones that are shooting themselves in the foot are Europeans. They're bearing the brunt of this.
Yeah, you mentioned previously Milanovic, and yeah, I've been following his and sharing his comments. He's been doing well, but as for all the rest, you know, the mayor of Zagreb, Tomašević and Plenković, I mean, those are all globalist puppets.
Oh, absolutely.
And, yeah, and that confession of Bob Baer's, I saw clips of that not long ago, and I bookmarked the documentary to watch at a later point. So yeah, that was excellent as well. And just on the multipolarity, you know, BRICS plus, Belarus is talking about joining BRICS. So that's 2 Bs in BRICS now. And so do you think it's the real deal, this breaking away? So basically we'll have like a East and West, like a bipolar world?
Well, it's possible. What is happening, and I think what we all understand, that the unipolar world is over. I think the fiat currency and the war in Ukraine and our hunger to start another war elsewhere is the life support that we're looking for, because this is how we survive. War assures our survival and assures that transfer of wealth that the Western elites have become so dependent on. But again, you look at the Middle East, you know, Saudi Arabia and Emirates, Turks, Egyptians, plus South Asia, India, East Asia, they are all coalescing around some sort of a new trade bloc, new currencies. Russia and China are beginning to trade with one another in their own currencies. And I think crypto, which I am in no way an expert on this, kind of people start talking to me about it and it goes over my head, but I can certainly see that this is going to play a huge role in this type of de-dollarization and the elimination of the dollar as the global reserve. So, I mean, it's just a question. I don't think it's a question of if, it's just a question of when all of this is going to collapse all around us. But certainly it's worth considering how the East has in fact been buying gold for the past 3 decades, and the West has been selling it. So, I mean, you got to look at the economics around all of this, and BRICS is growing into a powerful bloc. And you're right, Belarus, of course, they're there. But even when you look at the geopolitical placement and how things are panning out in terms of this, even like social engineering that is permeating throughout the West, and I'm talking not just the United States, but the entire Western Bloc and especially Western Europe. But then you look at elements of former Yugoslavia, which, you know, parts of former Yugoslavia are not part of the European Union. But then even some areas that are part of the European Union, like Hungary, like Poland, like Czech Republic, Slovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, they are not on board at all with this entire woke, social engineering, Marxist indoctrination. So you have a lot of that, like national and healthy national awakening and patriotism happening on that side, on the Eastern Bloc. So, I mean, even when you look at what was happening, let's say with the Trump administration and who voted for Trump, for example, in 2016, it's a lot of these people from, which is why I became instrumental in his administration, not only running Serbian Americans for Trump, but some of these other communities that have been.
We're out of time, Dr. Ravasi. About 20, 25 seconds left. Great
no
conversation.
Problem. I just wanted to make a point how some of these communities who have experienced this in their native countries became key in voting for President Trump because they understood what this means, and they are fighting tooth and nail against it.
Thank you, Dr. Ravasi.